Hi, in this video I'd like to talk about some suggestions about how to write developmental rubrics, both how to write the quality criteria themselves, how to word the skills at the bottom, and how to construct the rubric overall. This is our interpretation of the rubric writing guidelines, the 10 guidelines that were developed at the Assessment Research Centre at Melbourne University, and to check them out, they are right there. So if you want some explanations from the researchers at Melbourne Uni themselves, check out that link there. So let's get into it. So firstly, the quality criteria, and that's the things that are written inside the boxes, should describe performances of increasingly higher quality. Yeah. So you can get some support and ideas for verbs from taxonomies, some of which you've probably heard of before, but it's completely fine to mix up different taxonomies in one rubric, whatever you think describes typical performances of students. We want to end up with something like that, and so that one there is a typical use of knowledge rubric, which is basically taken straight from Bloom's taxonomy. Quality criteria should only describe one action. If you find "and" in a criteria, then you need to question whether or not you need to split it up or something. So if there are two things in your quality criteria, you've got a few options there. Do you want to get rid of one of them? You can't assess everything in one rubric. Do you want to split the criteria into two and maybe one's more difficult than the other? Or do you think that they are two completely different skills and you want to have an entirely new column in your rubric? So in the example in red there, we could change it to identify and then describe being harder. That again is taken from Bloom's taxonomy. Quality criteria should describe what students do, say, make, or write. So stuff that is externally visible by a teacher. You can't have in our rubrics words like know, believe, think, or understand, because we can't see that. We don't know that a student understands something unless they demonstrate it externally to us. So instead of student understands trigonometry, we might say student solves trigonometry problem. The criteria should be as short and simple as possible, and a lot of the advice we're giving here is so that it's easier for users of the rubrics. If the rubrics are full of really, really lengthy criteria, they're less likely to be read by learners, particularly teenagers. So I would even not include stuff like I can, the, or of. Yes, try and have like one phrase, not even a whole sentence if you can help it. So here's an example of one which is really lengthy, and we were able to turn it into something much shorter like that, which hopefully, now obviously you still want to make sure that you're capturing the main idea in the criteria. Quality criteria should not have any counting or pseudo-counting. This is a really, really common one. You often see people using some, many, most. Now the reason why it's not a good idea to have counting in rubrics is because it's generally not the case that simply more of something means that it's better. You might find that having more of something means that the student is able to perform some higher function, in which case your criteria should just describe that thing that they're able to do. So for example, in an English essay, you might see rubrics that say uses 1 quote, uses 5 quotes, uses 10 quotes, whatever. Instead of just counting the number of quotes, it would be better to say what a student who has 10 quotes can do that a student who's only used 1 quote can do. So for example, if you're using 10 quotes, perhaps you're able to determine the author's purpose or something like that. So instead of having a rubric counting spelling mistakes, something along the line of spelling impairs readability. Quality criteria should not repeat lower criteria. That's when you get into the problem of having the highest criteria being really, really long and wordy. So you just teach people how to interpret the rubric. Yeah? Higher criteria assumes that they can do the lower criteria. So in this example here, you'll see all that stuff in yellow is just repeating stuff from other criteria that doesn't need to be in there. Just teach students that in this example, if they got the 100%, then that means that they also have provided at least 3 main arguments. And obviously there's other problems with that one because it's got numbers in it. Criteria should not be a list of procedural steps, and that's because each step themselves could have levels of quality. So for example, if you had a rubric with higher and higher levels of writing, intro, writing paragraph, writing conclusion. Now, all three of those things could be done to varying degrees of quality. So instead of having those three, which are just steps, you could have something along the lines of the lowest level being uses essay structure, so just includes those elements. And then we've found that it's harder for students to write topic sentences for each of their paragraphs, and then even harder than that is writing good linking sentences, and this is assuming that you're using a TL structure for essay writing. Quality criteria should not use ambiguous language, and this is very common, so it's really important to try to avoid this. Ambiguous language means that the different learners, different teachers are not on the same page, and there's as many different interpretations of some of these words as there are people reading it. So words like thorough, suitable, expert, sophisticated, what do those words mean? If you notice that you're using a lot of adverbs and adjectives in your criteria, you might find that you're accidentally putting ambiguous language. Here's a really quick example of something with lots of ambiguous language in it. Yeah, limited, adequate, effective, outstanding, satisfactory. What do these mean? Criteria should not use negative language. You basically just teach students that higher criteria imply a lack at a lower criteria. So for example, instead of saying lacks tone as the lowest one, you could just say speaks or speaks to the class, and the higher one could say uses tone to enhance speech. And then a student, if they get assessed as speaks, it's implied, after you've explained to them how to interpret the rubric, that if they've been assessed at that one, then they can't do that one because that's higher up. A couple of different reasons here. The purpose of developmental rubrics is to try and assess what students can do so that we can teach them from that point. And also we're trying to remove some of the negativity and some of the negative judgment that is often associated with assessment. Quality criteria and skills should, if where possible, start with a verb in the present tense. So instead of interconnection found, you might say finds interconnection. That's simply to improve the usability and readability of the rubric for different users of it. Quality criteria and skills should also be written in active, not passive language. So instead of quotes used, it should be users quotes. Those last two pieces of advice are so that students know what they have to do to be assessed at that level. Now, in terms of rubric construction, rubrics should ideally have 4 or less criteria per skill. That helps make different teachers are more likely to assess student work at the same level because there's not so many finely grained criteria. Also, even in a class as big as, say, 30 people, it's unlikely you're going to need more than 4 criteria to represent the spread of a typical class. And if you know that there are more than 4 levels of that skill, that's fine. What we're just saying is a rubric for a particular assessment shouldn't have more than 4. You might have more than 4 skills in a larger framework document from which you draw out an individual rubric. We also think that rubrics should have 5 or less skills, unless you're assessing at multiple occasions. So perhaps you might assess the planning part of a piece and then assess it again after the actual thing was done. So they might, you might assess them doing a storyboard and then assess them in a second time period after they've done a short film or whatever. And basically, having rubrics that have got more than 5 skills become very difficult to mark, and that's something that needs to be taken into account. And also, you don't want to give students too much feedback. Teacher time is valuable, and if you're giving students too much feedback that they can't work, that they can't actually correct, then there's not much point giving to them. It's unlikely that your typical teenager is going to be able to take on much more than 5 pieces of feedback, say 1 for each skill. So here's an example of a rubric that breaks that rule. There's just way too much going on there. That'd be very hard to mark and very difficult for a student to get much use out of. Rubrics should also have the lowest criteria being something that every student can do, and the highest criteria should be a stretch target. So we're trying to capture within a rubric for one piece of assessment the full diversity of learner ability. So the bottom one should be, think what will the weakest student do with the skill, and that is you write a sentence describing that, and that's your lowest, and you think, what would the best student do on a good day, and that's your highest criteria. You should avoid applying weighting to different skills. This confuses the purpose of assessment. So developmental rubrics are best used as really high quality qualitative feedback rather than as grading. So a lot of people want to weight different skills because they want to place more emphasis on one skill rather than another. You can bend this piece of advice by having more or less criteria. So for example, we used to have 4 levels of criteria for bibliographies, but we found that that was putting too much emphasis just on a bibliography, and so we reduced it just to 1. So like either they've got a perfect bibliography or they get not shown. And here's a crazy rubric with an example of some seriously over the top weighting. There you go. 3C plus 2O plus 2G plus 1.5V plus 1M over 40 times 10. Very difficult to interpret. We also think that it's good to avoid using judgmental labels for the levels. So you often see rubrics with these level statement, with the names beginner, developing, accomplished, exemplary. Again, this is needless judgment, and there's no real good learning basis for including these terms, and so my advice would be to just have the criteria and no need for the levels. Explain to students that the quality goes up as you go left to right or down to up, depending on which way you're doing it. Now, obviously schools are required to generate grades. How do you generate a grade from a developmental rubric? Essentially, our advice is that you, I'll just get the example up here. Our advice is that you create some kind of conversion table. So essentially, rubrics shouldn't be, unless your school's got some other reason, rubrics shouldn't be changing the average grades and typical spread of grades that you give students. So assess work and then decide what will we have given that under our old system, and then make a conversion chart that represents that. So in this example here, if a student gets, the rubric count, you get that by counting up to and including all of the boxes that got assessed at. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The rubric count is 8, and so we said, after looking at that student's piece of work, yes, under our old system that would be worth about a C, so we'll make a rubric count of 8 worth a C, and then you can just fill in the rest of it there. Obviously, having the highest stretch target achieved is 100%, and then you've got to come to some kind of decision amongst your own teaching team as to how you're going to convert the rest. The reason why it's a good idea to have a conversion rather than just the rubric count divided by the total possible is it makes your average mark too low. So in this example, the rubric count's 8, total possible 16, 8 divided by 16 is 50%, but we wouldn't want to say to the student that they've got a 50%. That's not the marks that the students would be expecting to get. Just 3 notes to make at the end. The best ingredients for when you're writing a rubric from scratch are taxonomies, having some student work, and a small group of experienced teachers. We've found that it's usually, when you're writing a rubric completely from scratch, better to have even just like 2 or 3 teachers, and then if there's a bigger team, take it to them for feedback afterwards. With too many working on it from scratch, you might find it difficult to make headway. Rubrics aren't always the best form of assessment, particularly if the task can be described as true or false. So for example, a maths test might not be best assessed against a rubric, although you might use a rubric to make sure that you're assessing students' skills, higher order thinking skills, rather than just a lot of regurgitation. If you have a lot of small bits in the assessment that students simply need to do them, rather than have that on the rubric, you could have a separate hurdle requirement. So, down the bottom of your rubric, you might have things that students need to tick off to say you have to have done that to even have it marked in the first place. And finally, there's no such thing as a perfect rubric. You'll find that even after you've been writing the same rubric and improving it over years, that it still needs tweaking. Particularly, you hopefully will find that the highest level will need to be increased in difficulty as you get better at teaching that skill, and as students get better, as student skills improve because they are taught in a consistent way over a number of years. And finally, just going to give you a little animation of what a rubric construction might look like. So here we go. So you got your rubric like that. Now a lot of people go left to right. rather than up to down. That's fine. Not shown. This level here is simply if you didn't see any evidence of that skill at all. That's not to say they were doing it badly. That's the example of like if they just missed a part of the assessment. So you write your skills starting with verbs. You got your lowest level, something everyone can do. You got your highest level, something is to stretch even for your best students. I find writing rubrics from scratch, it's best to write the lowest. So you write your skills, then write the lowest, then write the highest, and then fill in the middle. It's completely fine to have big gaps between those levels there, as long as they're typical dropping off points for students in terms of their performance. And that is some advice about writing developmental rubrics. Thank you.